All right. Thank you all for joining us this morning at our second FC Build conference. So since many of you in the audience are new to FC Build, let me just start with a very short introduction to Foundation Capital. So Foundation was formed in 1995. We're an early stage venture firm managing $4 billion in capital, and more than 30 of our companies have gone public over the last couple of decades. We've backed some extraordinary entrepreneurs, and in our enterprise practice, in particular, we've been fortunate to partner with founders in enterprise infrastructure up and down the stack. So from cloud, data, AI automation, DevOps, as well as B2B, SaaS, and cybersecurity. We primarily lead seeds and Series A's, usually before the company has any revenues or even a product in some cases. So what that means basically is we invest in extraordinary dreamers with extraordinary dreams and work with them to make it real. With that, I want to introduce you to two extraordinary dreamers, my friends Gina Bianchini and Zoe Skamman. By way of background, Gina is a friend of now, 20 years. She's the founder and CEO of Mighty Networks, which she started 10 years ago, and which has become the premier SaaS platform for creators and brands to start and grow communities that they actually own. Prior to Mighty, Gina was co-founder and CEO of Ning, where we worked together, and before that was a co-founder and president of Harmonic Communications. Zoe is the founder of Bodacious, a brand and strategy studio with a focus on the future of fandoms, new forms of entertainment, the creator economy, and even blockchain and crypto native projects. Her clients include some of the boldest, most audacious brands on the planet, so think companies like Netflix, Nike, Snapchat, Mark Cuban, and of course his beloved Dallas Mavericks. So with that, knowing you both as no bullshit builders, I'd love to dive straight into the deep end and get each of your hot takes on the recent announcements by the likes of Facebook. I guess Friday it'll be Meta, Square. I don't know when that becomes Blocks. Or even our own Solana, which just hosted more than 2,000 developers at its conference in Lisbon a couple weeks ago. And I think a lot of folks in our audience are watching all this and wondering about the future of social, of Web3, how it'll impact their businesses. And you guys have tons of great thoughts in this regard. So maybe, Gina, if I could have you kick it off with your hot takes on all the crazy stuff that's sort of been happening of recent.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. And anytime I get to spend time with you, Steve, and you, Zoe, is a highlight. So, I think the way that I would answer the question, kind of given what we're, who we all are and who are a part of this, this event right now, is as an entrepreneur. So as an entrepreneur, as an early stage entrepreneur, as somebody who might be paying attention to Web3 and what is happening with Web3 and like where the world is going, it feels like it is happening now. And so if you are like, and if anybody who's watching this, like raise your hand or like write in the comments just around like, you might be building an HR SaaS business, asking yourself, do I need an NFT? Like, or how am I thinking of like, is HR going to become decentralized? And do I have to start thinking about this stuff? And I went down that path over the last 6 months, and actually how Zoe and I got to know each other. And my take on this moment is the following. One, Web3 is inevitable. It is inevitable that we are going to see how being a part of communities, being a part of a network that has a network effect associated with it, that more and more value is going to go to the participants, the nodes in those networks, in a way that when you look at Web 2 or you look at social, certainly platforms like what we were building with Ning that focused on ownership, I think they're only actually going to get more relevant from here.
Yep.
But really the core of Web 2 was around, you come to my platform, you rent attention, and we monetize that. And I think that's changing very rapidly. But I also think that as we look at Web3 and as we look at the opportunities that increasingly our customers, our members, our participants are going to want more from the things that they truly invest in, it's also going to be slower in terms of mainstream adoption than it feels like it is if you follow, .eth accounts on Twitter and you're like sitting there and you're just like, you've got to ask yourself the question, like, am I going to make it? Am I actually going to make it here? Or it's like, I know we're all going to make it, but it's like, am I going to make it? And so maybe that's just me, but I doubt it's just me kind of feeling this way and thinking this way. But I think, we're at just this really interesting moment in terms of the transition from where we've been to where we're going. And I think because we're so hyper connected, it feels like it's happening faster. But if we take a step back, we're talking about 500,000 people that are actively participating in crypto projects and Web3. And it's going to get a lot bigger from here. That's how exponential growth works. But staying focused on one's own purpose, paying attention to community, investing in community, and looking at what am I creating in terms of the relationship and dynamics with the people I'm bringing together, broadly speaking, I think is the answer.
What I love about where you're going, Gina, and Zoe, I want to weave you into this, is this sort of tension. And the thing that I love about sort of Web3 is there's tension between self-sovereignty around your data and your identity and your contributions, and also the benefits of community. So like getting community, but on your terms. And in fact, if I kind of think back onto some of our earliest investments in and around crypto, whether it's sort of the layer ones or some of the apps being built on it, there was kind of this almost kind of like platonic ideal of one person, one token. So you could imagine sort of like the Leonardo DiCaprio token, like, and how do I invest in everything that he touches? Not that I'm a Leonardo DiCaprio fan, but there's also sort of like, there's this sort of company version of that as well, or the startup version of that, that's sort of perhaps the sort of right way for some of our entrepreneurs to thinking about it. So there's kind of like these theoretical concepts that are quite beautiful about Web3. And then there's a sort of practical reality of what we can actually build over time. And so I love that sort of tension and kind of where we end up and how quickly we end there will be fun to watch. But Zoe, I know you've been doing a ton of work in this area. What are your thoughts on kind of, these recent announcements and even Gina's comments around sort of where this is going?
I would completely agree. I think, where we are right now with Web3 is we're in the plumbing stage. We are basically building the infrastructure, we're building the pipes. The pipes are getting clogged quite a lot, as we probably know from Ethereum and gas fees and all of that kind of stuff. And we've just got lots of, L1s, as you said, sort of layer ones popping up. But I think what's going to be really interesting to watch over the next couple of years is what happens to the L2s. And, when I'm talking to clients about it, I describe it like the iPhone in the App Store. So, when you first got the iPhone, it was kind of shiny and exciting, but it was a phone. And it was still, you'd use it for SMS, you'd use it for calls, and that's pretty much it. And what really took off when it came to the iPhone was when third-party developers started to build apps, utilities, entertainment, shortcuts, all of that kind of stuff into the phone. And suddenly you don't really need to know anything about, the software. You're just actually using it for whatever you need to use it for. And that's kind of where I think we're going to get to when it comes to blockchain. But, as Gina was mentioning, we are so early right now. And if you live in the Twitter hype bubble, which to be totally honest, I do, it feels like it's urgent and it's everywhere and everybody needs to jump on it. So I'm getting lots of big brands calling me saying we need to get into NFTs. And my pushback is always, okay, why? What's your use case? What are you going to do with this other than it being a kind of PR exercise and shoddily developed and not necessarily well thought through? And it's all about rushing to have that PR story. But actually, if you really think about what Web3 is offering us, it is a fundamentally different structure of the internet where we start thinking about value creation and value distribution, which hasn't been there before.
Right.
And that potentially means value creation and value distribution from a business model perspective. So do you want to rush into NFTs from a PR perspective, or do you really want to start understanding what ownership and data portability and self-sovereignty is going to mean for the way that you set up your products, your services, and the way that you monetize the business as well?
Yeah. Do you have a favorite example? I was thinking as you were talking, and Gina, you kind of made me think of this as well, as we're not investors, but there's a company I really admire called Audius, which is built on top of Solana. I think, Zoe, you might know of them as well. And it has roughly not quite a couple 100,000 artists on it, musicians primarily. It's basically a decentralized version of Spotify, mostly for kind of EDM music and hip hop. But what I think is so incredible about it is it hits to this point I think both of you care about, which is like artists basically, it's built for not labels, but artists, and artists can directly drop their content on there. They have direct relationships with their fan base. And when the audio token actually benefits, they benefit as well. And so it's very much kind of like this tight coupling as both of you are talking about. Are there examples that you kind of go to or that you admire kind of that are doing it right and not just doing the bullshit kind of PR thing where whatever, there's like, Nike saying, hey, someone said NFT, so we need to have some NFT offering? Because I think there's extremes in both ends, or I should say extremes where people are just doing it for the headline as opposed to like for real value.
Yeah, I think there are probably quite a few at the moment, actually mostly in the music space. There's another one which is just starting now with a huge amount of investment from a musician called Blau. And he's doing a very similar thing, which is looking at actually how do I start to fractionalize my songs and the royalties so that actually people are funding my music, but it's almost like a Kickstarter project where actually if my music then takes off, then they get a royalty payment out the back of however many streams it gets on Spotify, those kind of things as well. So I think the more interesting ones at the moment are the ones that are having real utility baked into them. And that idea of what you were just saying of shared upside. So if I'm a fan and I absolutely love Justin Bieber, for example, and, Justin Bieber is bringing out a new album, but he wants to go direct to fans. Do I want to have a share, not only in supporting him initially, which gives me the warm, fuzzy feeling, but also thinking that when I advocate that album, when I tell all of my friends to listen to that album, I'm kind of doing the PR work for him. So arguably, should I share in the success of that album, which I'm also out there promoting and advocating as well? And prior to now, we haven't done that. We've had these massive gatekeeper platforms. Spotify is one of them. Facebook is another one of them. Even TikTok is a gatekeeper of sorts as well. Whereas Gina said, you come along, you create content, which we've almost been trained is for free, and they monetize the engagement and the eyeballs off the back of it and sell it to advertisers. So we are constantly creating content and value for them, but we're not realizing any of it. And so the minute you take the gatekeeper out of the equation and the creators are going direct to their fans, suddenly you've got a completely different incentive structure where they are sharing and creating and earning value together because it's a shared relationship. An artist can't succeed without their fans, and a fan is looking for someone who they can be passionate about.
I love that. I feel like that was the basis for you starting Mighty. Like there's so much around this isn't about feeding the advertising beast. This is about authentic connection. But yeah, go for it, Gina.
Yeah, well, and what I was just going to say to build on that I think is so interesting about this moment is one, a currency with value, both creation and basically value creation built into the model is so much more elegant than affiliate programs,
right?
Or other ways that people have sought to try to get at how do you motivate financially fans, super fans, so we're certainly, thank goodness, we're moving away from the model of like, I've sort of always felt like the Web2 platforms have thought about the greater fool theory, I would never do customer support for Polycom in the customer support forums, but some other idiot is like more than happy to do that, and so we're moving from that model to one that basically says, you can both have fun, value, meaning, identity, and financial upside in a way that hasn't been possible. Now, here's the downside. The vast majority of this stuff today is incredibly complex and confusing. And it's actually, I think, one of just the natural as we're having this fragmentation and decentralization, and I believe that the world moves and bends towards decentralization. They bends towards unique, interesting cultures doing unique and interesting things. people also, I've observed, have a tendency to complexify things. And the vast majority of people today are also not economists. So we're at this sort of messy middle part where there's a lot of really fantastic experimentation, the experimentation that you want, but we're also trying to cover up, sort of, and Zoe writes a lot about this, and I think it's just spot on with what I'm seeing. You also have to have an underlying meaning and purpose to the community beyond, voting or beyond the value of the NFT, because if you don't have that underlying purpose, motivation for an ongoing sustainable community, then what happens is you have an initial pop, the NFT value or the value of the coin goes to nothing.
Right.
And the same people are just moving on to the next.
They move to the next thing. No, you said two things that I want to make sure folks can absorb. Thing one is, it feels like the user experience still needs a ton of work, right? Like there is, for any of us who have spent time with MetaMask and hide our pass-phrases, in 5 different parts of our house, or, one in a safety box, or, just even just not MetaMask, but even other kind of Web3 experiences, it's like almost like we're back to the command line days of an interface. So that's thing one, which is, really thinking about the users and the user experience. And then thing two is this second point that you're bringing up, which is, if this is all kind of the bullshit hype, if you're just doing this without the sort of real value that you're kind of trying to create in mind, then you basically end up in this sort of, almost this conga line of like basically pump and dump of the next thing. And we've seen, I think, what I appreciate about kind of where we're at least as I see it in Web3, is all the kind of early speculators who were, very happy to kind of do what you just described and like rug the next group and kind of move on to the next community. Those folks, I sort of feel like have, a little bit of the smell has caught up with them. And then the more authentic folks who are actually trying to build real value, understand sort of community incentives. I mean, one of the things that was so neat about Solana was when they set up the foundation, 39% of the tokens were for community incentives. And most of the L1s at that time were single digits. They're like, no, it's all about founders and investors, and we'll give you 8% for the community. The fact that nearly 40% of their tokens were allocated to incentives for community is the reason why their community felt highly aligned to help make that community valuable, right? So getting that right, by the way, which was a founding issue, it wasn't something you could bolt on later, is so important. But I think your 2 points are, kind of user experience and authenticity around the real value you're trying to build.
Yeah. So those are my points. I'll add one thing to this, which I think is actionable and relevant for entrepreneurs and companies, which is there's an exercise to do without getting distracted by what's on chain, what's not on chain. What do you like? Which is okay. Actually, coming back to the network effect point.
Yep.
Because again, the most valuable businesses any of us are building are network effect businesses. The challenge is the cold start problem. And what is so exciting about Web3 is that there is a way to unlock the cold start, because there's the currency, there's
incentives. Yeah.
There's incentives. One of the things that I like to do, and I push myself to think about, is, okay, you take that off the table and you think about, okay, whether it's with the product that I'm building, how is the product that I'm building delivering a network that is valuable to each other? So that's sort of step one. And hopefully, anybody listening to this is like, duh, Gina, that's what all of us are doing. This is why we're here. You sound like Andrew Chen, which I think his writing on network effects is amazing. I think one of the most interesting things, especially as we think about the importance of community, of customers, of the ecosystem you're building going forward, is to say, I'm not ever going to start with what the economic incentives are. I'm going to start by what is the value, what is the usefulness of the community that I'm building. And I would argue that a community, especially for entrepreneurs that are still building out their product or where the product is not quite mature, a community is the fastest way to build the network part of a network effect in a way that you can start building value in terms of the relationships of your customer base with each other in ways that future-proof your business for the full force of experimentation with incentives and economic incentives and all the things that are coming from here, as opposed to, and in stark contrast to, jumping into the next thing because it feels like everybody else is doing it. Like, Zoe, I love the products of your clients, and I'm proud to be one of your clients, but like, we don't need an NFT from Coca-Cola. We don't need an NFT necessarily from the Mavs, but what we need is the value of that community and that all of those things. And then you have that, the economic incentives become the second order thing that just lights the whole thing up with bright lights and rocket fuel in all of the right ways, as opposed to pouring rocket fuel on something that, goes like this.
Yep. I love that distinction. And it actually reminds me a little bit of kind of how we think about open source projects, right? Which is, this sort of concept that like, you don't really need to or should even spend a lot of calories on the business model. And you're going to iterate on that so many times anyway, until you have the community, right? Like until you have the product. And in some senses, it's like, don't bother. Like the product should exist before the company exists.
Right.
And I think that parallel is interesting here. And obviously there are some other parallels to sort of open source communities and crypto communities, right? There's some interesting maps over to that. Now, maybe if you don't mind, like, so both of you have been building leaders in building communities for a long time now. Can you just like take us back to like what sparked that? I mean, I feel like I was around you when you were kind of doing that, Gina, but I'd love to hear Zoe kind of like kick us off with what sparked your passion and love for building community.
I mean, I think I started late in comparison to both of you. But I was working and living in Australia in 2008, which is when, Twitter arrived with a bang, Facebook was starting to grow, and I was working in an ad agency. And I was just fascinated in terms of the content that was being created and the idea of people being able to connect to one another, creating their own content, because that just hadn't necessarily been there before. And so I decided to leave the ad agency and start Australia's first social media agency. And arguably we were way too early. And we actually ended up going bankrupt in about 9 months, but it was super fun while it lasted. And I remember leaving and they said, "You're crazy. No one is ever going to advertise on Facebook. It's not safe for brands. Twitter's ridiculous because it's just people tweeting out what they're having for lunch every day. And that's pretty much all it can do." And I just thought there's something interesting in this in terms of actually people being able to connect to one another and actually showcasing interest in one another. And I started to see these kind of pods happening, on Twitter. So, there was definitely an advertising Twitter, but there was a cookery Twitter, there was a gardening Twitter, there was a, best beaches for a Friday afternoon Twitter, that kind of stuff. And I just thought this is really interesting. And actually, what if these, topics, which, to be honest, have been living on the internet anyway, in sort of forums and GeoCities and all this kind of stuff, regardless, but it was now getting bigger and it had more of a pedestal and more of an amplifier. What could that potentially mean? And I think just kind of jumping into that space, both feet in was super interesting. And the first brief that we got was actually for Rockstar Games to launch Grand Theft Auto 4, which was the Ballad of Gay Tony. And it was fascinating because it was us going really, really deep on these gamer sub-communities that had popped up in the recesses of Facebook and Twitter and Reddit and all of that kind of stuff. And just thinking, rather than doing a big sort of broadcast campaign, direct to the hardcore gamers and figure out what they want and turn them into advocates and kind of flip the megaphone in the other direction. And that was, the first time I really got into it in a very deep way. And I just thought, this is amazing.
Wow. Awesome. Gina, what was your sort of like, what was that spark for you? And it sort of feels like it's colonized your career for the last 10, 15 years. What was it?
It wasn't actually in the starting moments of it. So,
Okay.
in terms of, I don't feel like I was actually, I feel like I was like kind of walking around in the dark. And then for me, it was after we put Ning networks out and watching how people were using it,
Yeah.
and the people that I met, and the subcultures, and just how interesting everybody was. I fell in love with the weirdness of it. I really, no, I did. Like, I was like, oh my gosh, like I did not realize just how interesting people are.
Right.
And by the way, that's in lightness and darkness.
Yeah.
But I think that, and then I certainly believe very passionately that the way that you create more lightness and is to let millions of communities bloom in
Right.
their own spaces, in their own ways, with their own cultures. And I think that sort of the monoculture of Web 2 has been problematic. It's something that, the reason I've been working on this as long as I've been working on it is because it hasn't been that popular until now.
Right.
Where and what's beautiful about it being popular now and increasingly popular is like there's a bunch of stuff we've actually learned about how to address the cold start problem, how to actually not just grow communities, but grow them in really positive ways that don't have the same problems as what is really become expected on social media. And so to me, the magic of the work that I certainly do at Mighty is unlocking people's creativity in ways that are unexpected, but also, and I think this is the most important thing, is that it scales and it's sustainable.
Yeah, and super aligned with what those companies are building. I'm curious because I think my suspicion is so many of the folks on this hop in are, their kind of default when thinking about communities is to actually default to building on top of someone else's platform.
Right.
And that default feels like it should change and is beginning to. Kind of how should they be thinking about, as an entrepreneur starting a company, or maybe has $1 million or a few million in revenue, and maybe they've even already kind of, they've kind of begun that, down that path of building on top of someone else's platform. How can they kind of snap to grid and actually begin to take more ownership of the community, and then of course then benefit from the value that they're creating as a result of that?
Right. Well, I'm happy to answer, and then Zoe, you may have a totally different perspective on this. Here's what I would say is, one, know why you're doing it. And here's, like, depending on what we mean by on other people's platforms. So
Facebook.
Biggest problem with Facebook.
LinkedIn.
and so the reason people build on Facebook or LinkedIn, and I would even say Discord falls into this as well, is well, that's where everybody is. Like, you're not going to get fired for starting a Facebook group. Well, actually, increasingly you are. But I do actually think that's changed pretty dramatically. Yeah. But what I would say is that notion of like, well, this is where everybody else is. This is where people are. I'm afraid of asking people for another login. And then like these same people are like, oh, so the way you're going to join this new community is you're going to go download these 4 different services like MetaMask, and then you're going to make sure that you have voting over here, and you're going to do all these things, and then you're going to use Discord, but Discord is like overwhelming and is kind of a mess. And by the way, as the entrepreneur in charge of this community, I don't have access to any of the data, any of the members, any of the email addresses on either Facebook or Discord. So the irony is that there's almost been this setup, this dynamic of like, we are in the old world of we have no data, or we're in the new world of like everything's on the chain. And there's actually a middle path, which is creating like, oh, and by the way, everybody has websites. So like, it's not like anybody doesn't have a website on Squarespace or new services or things like that. So I just find it's really interesting that the most obvious way to build successful communities and by the way, a community is the fastest way to a network effect, is on a platform where it's designed for ownership by the entrepreneurs, by the brand, for the communities that they're building. Full access to data, engagement so that they actually want to come back. But it also has spontaneity and structure, so it's not all chaos or like an empty ghost town.
Right.
And that's what we're building at Mighty, and it's working. So the really fascinating thing that I think every entrepreneur is well served by also looking at, which is what percentage of your customers are coming from, so you can build a community before you have a product. And that the more that you actually bring people together in a community around their identity, not your product,
Yep.
you actually will build a network that's getting more valuable to people even before you have a product. So your product, you drop it in and the value just is dramatically higher, and you've multiplied it and leveraged it in a way that most people are still starting with. Most entrepreneurs are still starting with their product first, and then, oh, by the way, we should probably bring our customers together to talk about our product.
This customer point is super important, and I've seen this in even our kind of infrastructure enterprise companies, where if they, for example, have a constellation of customers who are all, call it sort of media and entertainment, or all e-commerce, bringing them into that community early, sort of helping inform the roadmap, sharing sort of new ideas and friendly betas. That has been absolutely invaluable for those companies, and they feel super special. They feel like they've been, kind of included in a sort of secret process.
Well, also they're meeting people that are helping them in their careers. It's not just about buying you shit. It's about like, how are they going to make more money? How are they going to be more successful? How is ultimately the solution that you're building going to help that person get promoted? It's a total shift in how you think about entrepreneurship, I think.
Yep. Zoe, what are your thoughts? And how do you, when Nike comes to you or the Mavs say like, hey, we got to build community and like the default is Facebook, how do you kind of coach them through that? And what are some of the, the sort of lessons learned in terms of how to think as an entrepreneur who's sort of starting from day zero even?
I think, the key thing is exactly as Gina was saying, is those are not really communities on those platforms. If you're on Instagram, if you're on TikTok, if you're on even Snapchat, for example, the only way for the people that are viewing your content to interact with you is to comment or share or view. And that's literally it. And that's not a community, that is an audience. So you're still broadcasting to an audience. What we're talking about when it comes to network effect is the power of community is actually peer-to-peer, member to member. So you can still be the figurehead, you can be the symbol that brings those people together. But the real value of community is, are they chatting amongst themselves? Are they having a lovely time just kind of getting to know someone with a shared interest or a shared passion that they may have? And that's where the network effect kicks in, because the more people that join your community, the more you as the symbol or the figurehead can kind of step back. And it means you can take your foot off the gas a little bit. It means you're not jumping on a content conveyor belt, constantly filling a grid or, uploading stories or whatever it is on any platform that you're doing. And, just what Gina was saying previously as well, it can be a really interesting thing to do, to actually start a community before you have a product. And a couple of examples of that is Glossier. So, Glossier, the absolutely massive makeup and skincare brand, in the US, they actually started from a blog. They had no product. And she would bring together a community of people who loved, looking at other people's makeup cabinets in their bathrooms. And they started talking about, their favorite consistency of lip balms and the kind of packaging that they would want and the colors that they liked. And the first product was born as a result of that community feedback loop, which was the lip gloss. And then the next product was the face wash, which again was a community focused discussion and feedback loops before they even launched it. Another example is Modern Fertility. So Modern Fertility started a closed Slack channel for women who were struggling with fertility issues, which obviously is a very sensitive subject, and it helps to be able to actually speak to someone who has been through, what you're going through or is going through it at that particular point in time. So it became a safe space, and they would provide, experts and thought leaders, once a week that people could listen to. And from there came the shaping of a product that would actually help those women, and a kind of product line, came from that as well. And then you've also got passion adjacent communities. So there's a clothing brand called Hot Topic, who basically specialize in kind of merch and, fast fashion for teenagers, gamers, that kind of stuff. they've set up an anime Discord server. So absolutely nothing to do with their brand. And it's called Anime and Beyond. And what they've realized is that adjacent to their audience are anime fans. So could they actually set up a passion-based community all around anime? And it's very, very new. But my guess is they're going to start jumping into anime co-creation in terms of merch design, characters, all that kind of stuff. And it's going to pull back into their business. But they're going to use that anime Discord channel to basically get feedback and ideas from their community and see what they're excited by. Some of those different examples of the community, we tend to think of community, if we're calling it a community, as almost a nice to have thing, like a Facebook group or an Instagram, and you hand over the keys to a grad that's been out of school for about 5 minutes and you go, can you just, any customer complaints, can you just direct them to the customer service email? Thanks very much. Maybe interact a little bit with Iris on a Friday, if she's kind of getting a bit overzealous or something like that. But what we're doing is we're putting it as a kind of fluffy, nice to have at the end of all of our other efforts. And what we need to do is move it from the end to the beginning and actually tap into, as Gina was saying, unlocking creativity, potential ideas, product pipelines, all of that kind of stuff. And then just listen, take those feedback loops, co-create with them. Say, do you like this color or this color, this consistency or that consistency? And then what you're doing is you're co-creating a product which is built for them, and then you're selling it back to them. And then they feel like they've had a role in actually putting it together. So suddenly they're becoming even bigger advocates, as if they were just the kind of nice to have, on the end of the process.
I love this thread, and it reminds me of kind of one of my observations from designing products early in my career was this sort of the difference between designing with and designing for. Yeah. And the sort of designing for is sort of the instinct I think most product designers have, which is like, oh, here's this problem, I'm going to go solve it. And when you actually, to your point, Zoe, when you actually include your audience in the right way, and build quickly and kind of use that audience to help inform your initial spec, but then of course refine it through that sort of build, test, learn cycle. Yeah. That's when they feel more, engaged around the process, much more woven into its success, and you end up just with a better product faster, right? So I'm curious, Gina, actually, Mighty, are you seeing companies do this where they start the community before the product even exists? And what are some of the examples? I see Chris Gorog asked this question, share some of the successful community building experiences from your platform. I'd love to hear some of those case studies.
Yeah. In terms of even before they have built out the product themselves, that is happening more and more. One of my favorite examples is actually from a creator as opposed to a company or a brand, which is the Slow AF Run Club for back of the pack runners. And what he did by having a community, not only has he sold now a book that he's in the process of writing, but he actually came up with his idea for virtual races, virtual marathons, and 10Ks during the pandemic, all through bottoms up demand in the community. So to Zoe's point, and as you were talking, I was, that is a perfect example of the community. Everybody talks about communities being so hard. They're like so much work. They're actually, I would argue, much easier than producing a bunch of content and content marketing. And the second thing is that they have something that content marketing won't give you, which is new ideas. Mm-hmm. So we have actually seen over and over again that whether it is these kinds of virtual races where, again, ended up being a 6-figure revenue stream for an individual creator, we see it all the time at Mighty Networks in terms of what we end up building and what actually matters. And
that the community is surfacing, the community is a source of whatever, 20% or 30% of your actual next gen kind of roadmap and features.
60%.
60%. Holy shit. That's amazing.
Yeah. And now again, it can sometimes steer you wrong as well, because you have to be careful about like who's the most vocal, and how do you balance that? But fundamentally, I think a community is anyone doing anything, their secret weapon.
Very cool. So maybe the flip of the question is the sort of, what are the pitfalls, particularly as you think about, again, our audience being kind of early stage enterprise entrepreneurs? What are the kind of 1 or 2 things that they just like will probably get wrong and they should avoid, and you guys can kind of help inoculate them to making the same mistakes that you've seen others make?
Well, the thing I would say is it is nearly impossible as a Silicon Valley style investor, not investor, but entrepreneur, to not start with product. We've all grown up in the era of MVPs, of it's all about product-led growth, like product. I would argue that the moment to break out and do something new in terms of how do you create an advantage before you build before you write your first line of code is a community. So I would actually make the argument that, and certainly if I was starting over again with like a new thing I would want to go build, I would start with the community. I would start with the relationships. I would start with how do I bring value through the relationships and the network that I am building amongst a certain set of people that is valuable independent of the product I'm building.
Yep.
And that's Glossier. I think that's a great example. And then when you deliver the product, first of all, you already have a ton of credibility. You already have people coming back for other reasons. So you actually get multiple bites at the apple in the way that if all you're doing, starting with the product, announcing your fundraise on TechCrunch, building out the product more. Oh, just wait till the next version of the product. And you're not thinking about what is the value that I am providing to my future customer independent around the things that are important to them, not the things that are important to me. I think it may sound the same for what we're all doing. It's not. It is pretty fundamentally different.
It also feels far less perishable, right? Because I think to the conversation at the beginning, like when you do it this way, the investment that they're making in the product, in the conversation, is not something they want to kind of let go of, right? Like you end up having kind of a more permanent kind of sticky relationship. Zoe, what for you are some of the sort of things that you're like, oh no, don't do that when you're coaching founders as they're getting started with respect to community?
I think there's kind of two massive things for me. One is don't just think that you can set up a community and then be like, right, well, I'm just going to let them mingle. And I love what Gina talks about, where she's just thinking, imagine it as a party. So, if you had a party, you would want party activities. You'd be introducing like-minded people to one another so they could actually have a conversation. You'd be thinking about the atmosphere. You'd be thinking about, the different snacks that you could put in there and, the incentives that you might have over the course of the night to get people to move from room to room. So you need to think about it as, a roadmap. How are you actually starting to glue these people together? How are you starting to springboard conversations and really put the effort into thinking about community roadmaps, repeatable events, ideas, challenges, all that kind of stuff as well. So I think that's a really key thing. And then the only other thing that I would mention is you don't need to take on every single piece of feedback or ideas that a community gives you. And I think that's a really key thing as well. Ultimately, you are the product creator. You are the CEO or the founder of your company. If someone says, I think your product's crap and I really hate the font on your website, you've got to take that with a big pinch of salt and just think, actually, does that mean that I need to change everything? Or does that mean that that's just one person? So I think it's learning to kind of take feedback in the right way as opposed to taking it wholesale.
And I'll add one just point to build on this, which is subtle, but I think along those same lines. I always think about it as like, as the community designer, because we're designing communities. We're not building them. We're not like managing them. We're designing them. When you're designing a community, you always want to start with a point of view and make sure that point of view is flexible. But like, you never want to, like, when you go out to dinner with a group of friends and people are like, hey guys, where do you want to go? I don't know. Where do you want to go? Like, I'm open to anything. Like, you want to actually, as a community designer, be like, okay, so here are 3 options for where we're going to go. And then people could decide which one of those 3 options that they want. Or you're like, hey, we're going to go here. And they're like, don't really feel like that. Okay, great. What else do we want to do? But the fastest way to lose momentum in a community is to show up with that, hey guys, what do you want to do?
Yeah.
Energy and vibe.
Yeah, they're so much better. I think the point of like, you're better to use the community in that regard as sort of a sounding board, as opposed to, here's this sort of empty canvas.
Yeah.
You guys have been absolutely awesome. I'd love maybe one last thought, and it takes us kind of back to the very beginning. And it's a question that Bomborde asks of you both, which is, when we kind of think about how some of the Web 2 companies are approaching Web 3, there's a sort of like, in some senses, like we've got to pay attention because it's happening over there, and to ignore it would be, at our own peril. But there's also sort of like a, if Web3 succeeds, then there, it is highly distributive, right? Like they can't possibly maintain $1 trillion market caps. So how do you think about that sort of, Web 2 to Web 3? Is it going to be an entirely kind of, reshaping of these players, or do these guys actually figure out a way to kind of morph themselves into something that works for the future?
I think it's a really difficult one. I think, if you really think about it, Meta, I don't like that name at all. I feel like he's basically said like, oh, Metaverse, shiny, I'll have that. And I just, in order for them to succeed properly, in whatever the Metaverse turns out to be, or in Web3, he would have to completely undo his business model and everything that he makes money from and everything that he stands for. So it's not really possible. And I'm not sure if you saw the STARS announcement yesterday in terms of the virtual currency, and they actually had to disable comments because apparently there was hate speech and death threats. Because, quite rightly, people were looking at it going, what is this? This is terrible. This is almost you kind of saying, pay us money, we'll obfuscate it and do some cloak and mirrors, and then creators will get pennies, but we'll take the kind of lion's share of it. So I think in reality, what's going to happen is I think we're going to have a mix. I think it's going to be Web 2.5 for a very long time, where you're going to have some really interesting experimental, decentralized spaces. So, Decentraland, Sandbox, whatever Solana's going to be producing as well, which is super exciting. Also, decentralized social media is going to be a thing. And then I think you're also going to have centralized as well. I think those two are going to coexist for a time. And then who knows where it's going to go from there. But I think looking at the really big Web 2 players, and then they're saying we're going to jump on the Web 3 bandwagon. I mean, they literally can't.
Yeah.
Well, I also think that their founders all look at themselves still as those founders and see the same energy of the beginning of Web 2.
Yeah.
And so they're very attracted to that. And also, they never have to work a day in their lives ever again. And so they're drawn to the tech, like they're drawn to the technical challenges, the French court dynamic in terms of Silicon Valley and what's cool and hip, and what the most interesting people are paying attention to. I'll end on a hopefully not too obscure of a point on this, which is I just think about the old Dr. Seuss book about the Sneetches.
Oh, right on. Keep going. Share this.
So a guy shows up with a machine where it's like, hey, you can get a star on your belly, so you could be a star-bellied Sneetch. And then as everybody became star-belly Sneetches, and then nobody wanted to be star-belly Sneetch, basically it was like too common, he just flipped his machine and was like, hey, we'll take off your stars so you can be a plain-belly Sneetch, and then kept just doing this. And it was obviously, a story of in groups and out groups. But I think we have to be very careful that we're not looking to Facebook or Square or others as the guy with the machine.
Yeah.
And that we stay thoughtful and generous and make an independent path possible and sustainable. And I think that's where innovation is going to happen, where there is a bridge that needs to happen between Web 2 and Web 3, and going all the way to Web 3 in terms of like all of the challenging things. And we'll just make it easier. I actually think it's going to go the opposite, which is going to be a bridge into Web 3. And that's certainly, our strategy at Mighty.
So I am sure these thoughts are going to bounce around the halls for a lot of folks for, I know, a long time. And I'm super duper grateful, Gina and Zoe, for you sharing this insight and your experience. And so, thank you on behalf of all of us here, and super grateful. So thanks so much. Awesome.
Thank you.
Let you guys go. Bye for now.
Bye.